My name is Dr. Arlen Hayes. At least that is the name printed on the faded blue driver's license tucked inside my worn leather wallet. It's the name the cheerful young woman at the bank uses when she asks how I'm doing, a question to which she does not want a real answer. It's the legal fiction, the flimsy cardboard cutout of an identity that the United States government constructed for me nearly 40 years ago, in a sterile, windowless room deep in the bowels of a building that doesn't officially exist. That room smelled of industrial bleach and the quiet, metallic tang of fear. On that day, they took my real name, the one my mother whispered to me moments after I was born, and they treated it like a piece of sensitive intelligence. They packed it away in a manila folder, locked it in a secure filing cabinet, and buried that cabinet in a subterranean vault under a literal mountain of granite. Along with my name, they took my career, my future, and any chance I ever had of experiencing a full night of truly dreamless, untroubled sleep. I'm 72 years old now. The cardiologist I see every third Tuesday, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually forced smile, tells me my heart beats to the rhythm of a badly damaged drum. It's a chaotic, unpredictable patter that flutters and skips, a biological machine approaching the end of its operational life. He gives me another year, a generous estimate he feels obliged to make. Maybe 2, he adds, if I avoid stress and sudden shocks. A grim little joke that hangs in the air between us, a shared acknowledgement of the impossible. And I've decided, with the kind of stark, unadorned clarity that only a final, non-negotiable deadline can provide, that 2 years is not nearly enough time to carry the crushing weight of this silence to the grave. For 4 decades, I have been a good ghost, a model of obedient invisibility. I have honored the terms of the unwritten contract I signed that day. When you spend the most vital years of your life working for the true deep state, for the shadowy, load-bearing architecture that holds up the grand, brightly lit stage of American democracy, you learn that silence is not simply a matter of professional ethics or a signed non-disclosure agreement. It becomes a fundamental law of your personal physics, as immutable and as non-negotiable as gravity. The real machine of control is nothing like the clumsy, cinematic fantasies of Hollywood. There are no men in black coats with silenced pistols waiting for you in rainy alleyways. The reality is far more chilling, precisely because it is so profoundly administrative. It is banal. They simply erase you with paperwork. They build a fortress of bureaucracy around your former existence, a labyrinth of legal and financial dead ends, of misfiled records and suddenly inaccessible archives. They change your social security number. Your service record vanishes. Your academic transcripts become impossible to locate. You become a non-person, and they hand you the blueprints to a new, hollow life. You can scream, but the sound will be absorbed by the thick, soundproof walls of your new, government-subsidized anonymity. My official title was a masterpiece of obfuscation. Senior Information Analyst for the Division of Special Archival Projects, a sub-department of the Office of Naval Intelligence. The designation was so secret its very existence was classified. My job in reality was far simpler and far more terrible. I was a librarian for monsters, a janitor for skeletons. My task was to receive the ugliest, most inconvenient, and most inexplicable secrets dredged up by the vast net of global American intelligence, and to make them disappear. My job was to catalog, to cross-reference, to write summaries so sanitized they bore no resemblance to the truth, and then to bury these truths in the deepest, coldest, darkest archives on the planet. I was the man who closed the lid on Pandora's box, over and over again. I have read things that would permanently unravel a sane person's understanding of reality. I have held in my gloved hands reports on physics-defying propulsion systems recovered from the high desert of New Mexico, their metallurgy impossible to replicate, their power source still humming with a faint, unholy energy. I have reviewed interrogation transcripts with men who spoke languages that have never existed on Earth. Men who claim to be from places that are not on any map of this world. I have studied biological analyses of organisms dredged from the crushing blackness of the Marianas Trench, creatures that defied every known law of taxonomy and seemed to operate on a completely different set of biological principles. I have seen the plans for projects that weaponized human perception itself, that sought to turn dreams into broadcast signals and memories into tools of espionage. You learn, you have to learn, to build concrete walls in your own mind. You practice a kind of psychic triage. You compartmentalize. You stamp the file. Top secret. Eyes only. Code word access. You place it in its heavy lead-lined drawer. You turn the key, and you go home, and you pour 2 fingers of whiskey, and you force yourself to think about the crabgrass in your lawn or the leaky faucet in the bathroom. You learn to actively, aggressively forget. But there was one file, one simple, unassuming brown cardboard box that landed on my desk for recataloguing in the autumn of 1983. It was different. From the moment I saw it, I knew it was different. It didn't radiate the cold, dead energy of a historical secret. This box felt warm. It felt like it was still breathing. It didn't just contain a secret. It was a secret. A cancerous resonant secret that was still, in some way, alive. Its official mundane designation was File 77A9. But inside, on the handwritten label of a single 7-inch reel of magnetic tape, it had a name. A name that, even now, after all these years, makes the fine hairs on my arms stand on end and a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. Object Siren. And the story contained within that box, the truth of what happened to the 2 men it documented, has been a third presence in every empty room I've sat in for the last 40 years. I am breaking my oath of silence now, risking whatever administrative ghost they might send after me, for a reason that is both profound and, I am terrified to admit, possibly insane. It happened last Tuesday. The clock on my bedside table read 3:15 in the morning. I was sitting right here, in this worn-out armchair, the house cold and silent around me. Sleep, as it so often is, was a distant country to which my visa had been revoked. I had an old transistor radio playing softly on the windowsill, a late-night classical music station that broadcasts out of a small college 100 miles to the north. The signal was weak, a delicate thread of music awash in a vast, hissing sea of static. They were playing a cello solo, a modern piece by a composer I didn't recognize. It was a mournful, intensely beautiful composition, full of long, aching notes that seemed to hang in the dusty air of my room. And then it happened. For no more than 5 or 6 seconds, something else climbed aboard the radio waves and entered my home. It wasn't a burst of static or a competing station. It was a sound. A clear, impossibly pure harmonic overtone. A sequence of 3 rising notes that bloomed inside the cello's lament like a drop of ink in clear water. A sequence I had prayed I would never hear again. The blood drained from my face. A physical sensation of coldness spreading from my chest outwards to my limbs. An electric, specific dread washed over me. A forgotten emotional vintage I hadn't tasted since 1983. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a great and bottomless abyss, of hearing your own name whispered from the darkness below. It was the feeling I got when I first heard the Siren song. I switched off the radio, my hand trembling, and sat there in the ringing silence, my heart doing its frantic, broken dance against my ribs. I don't know what it was. A freak atmospheric condition. A stray signal from a passing satellite bouncing off the ionosphere. Or, and this is the most logical and yet least comforting explanation, it was the frantic misfiring of a dying old man's synapses, his memory playing a cruel, final trick on him in the lonely, vulnerable hours of the deep morning. But I cannot afford to rest on that comforting logic. I cannot take that chance. I cannot go to my grave hoping that it was just a phantom. Because if it is not gone, if that signal is still out there, sleeping in the static between worlds, then people must know. The world has to know what the United States Navy found, and what it so thoroughly tried to cover up in the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean in the year 1967. They need to know the truth about what happened to Chief Petty Officer Frank Miller and Petty Officer Second Class James Thompson, two men stationed at a remote, God-forsaken rock in the ocean officially designated SOSUS Listening Post Argus. They need to understand why the final, desperate entry in their official station logbook, scrawled over and over again in a looping, childish hand, was a single, impossible promise. We're going home. And they need to know, with absolute certainty, that the monster that came for them wasn't a creature with teeth and claws that lurked in the deep. It was a melody. It was a song of home. It all started for me, this long haunting, in the damp, gray autumn of 1983. I was a different man then. 32 years old, my back was straight, my mind was sharp, and my heart was still tragically full of a naive, dangerous, and ultimately misplaced patriotism. I still believed that the work we did in the fluorescent-lit, windowless catacombs beneath the Pentagon was a sacred duty, a necessary and noble darkness to protect the sleeping, sunlit world above. That was my first and my most profound mistake. The journey to Object Siren didn't begin with a trip across an ocean, but with a descent into the earth. It began with a summons. My supervisor, a man named Arthur Carlson, was a creature of the deep state in its purest form. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from gray limestone, with a face that showed no more emotion than a filing cabinet. He communicated in grunts, clipped phrases, and heavily implied meanings. His office was a perfect reflection of his soul, meticulously organized, utterly impersonal, and chilled to a constant 65 degrees Fahrenheit. He called me over the intercom, his voice a dry rasp of static, using my title, never my name. Analyst, my office, now. There was no please, there was no preamble. It was a command, as absolute as a presidential directive. I walked the long beige corridor to his office, the cheap government-issue carpet absorbing the sound of my footsteps, creating a sense of unnatural quiet. The air in this part of the facility always smelled faintly of old paper and anxiety. Carlson didn't look up when I entered. He was focused on a single sheet of paper on his otherwise empty desk. It was a transfer order, but it was printed on a pale blue cardstock I had never seen before, a color usually reserved for courier-only intelligence at the highest levels of classification. There's a unit in the Level 4 archive that needs recataloging and seal verification, he said, his eyes still fixed on the paper. Designation 77 Alpha Niner. He slid the blue card across the polished surface of his desk. It stopped perfectly at the edge, as if he had calculated the precise amount of force needed. You'll be escorted. Follow the protocol exactly. No deviations. That was it. That was the entirety of my briefing. But every detail was a blaring red flag. Level 4 wasn't a working archive. It was a tomb. It was the place where we sent files to be permanently buried. Records of projects that were so disastrous, so unethical, or so inexplicable that the official policy was to pretend they had never happened. No one retrieved things from Level 4, and the protocol sheet he had given me was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't a standard archival procedure. It was a multi-page document that read like instructions for handling a live nuclear weapon. It specified a full-body, positive-pressure environmental suit. It required 2 armed guards from the Special Security Detail, not the usual building security. And most alarmingly, it required a final sign-off from the department head himself, A man so deep in the shadows he was practically a ghost. A name on a letterhead that none of us had ever actually seen in person. This wasn't a clerical task. This was a ritual. The descent itself was the road to nowhere. The public elevators in the Pentagon, the ones for tourists and congressmen, are a known quantity. Our elevators were different. They were unmarked steel doors that opened with a specific keycard sequence, and they had no buttons for floors. You simply inserted a coded key, and it took you where you were authorized to go. The journey down was a silent, pressure-filled plunge into a colder, quieter hell. The first few sublevels were still part of the recognizable world. Sublevel 1, the massive server farms, buzzed with a constant high-pitched hum of millions of cooling fans, the air thick with the smell of hot electronics and ozone. Sublevel 3 was the central command bunker, a place I had only ever seen on diagrams, but you could feel its presence through the floor, a low, constant thrum of immense power and readiness. But below that, the world changed. The humming stopped. The air grew still and cold. The lights in the elevator car seemed to dim. We were descending past the active parts of the facility, past the nerve centers and the data hubs, into the building's deep memory, into the cellar. The guards who met me at the level 4 access point were not the usual bored-looking sentries. These were men from the SSD, clad in matte black combat gear, carrying short-barreled rifles held at a low ready. They didn't speak. They didn't even nod. Their eyes, visible behind their helmet visors, were flat and watchful. One of them held a heavy, sealed case containing my environmental suit. As I suited up, the hiss of the suit's internal circulation a loud intrusion in the oppressive silence. I felt a powerful, irrational sense of dread. It was the feeling of being an astronaut about to step out of the airlock into a hostile, alien world. The corridor to the archive itself was long and straight, lined with heavy steel vault doors, each one marked with a simple numerical designation and a single, ominous red light above it. Every single light was on, indicating that every vault was sealed and active. The air was frigid and my breath fogged the inside of my helmet's faceplate with every exhale. The only sound was the rhythmic squeak of my suit's boots on the polished concrete floor and the near-silent tread of the guards behind me. It felt like walking through a mausoleum for state secrets. We finally reached the end of the hall, which terminated in a single, massive vault door. It wasn't steel. It was a dull, gray metal I didn't recognize, and it was at least 2 feet thick. In the center was a heavy wheel, like something from a submarine. This was the entrance to the tomb. The lead guard produced a heavy, archaic-looking key from a pouch on his belt. The other guard stepped forward and began to turn the wheel. It took both his hands and all his strength to move it. The sound it made was a deep, groaning protest of metal on metal, a sound that seemed to echo not just in the corridor, but deep inside my own chest. There was a loud, percussive thunk as the last lock disengaged, followed by a long, slow hiss as the air pressure equalized. The great door swung inward, revealing a darkness so absolute it seemed to be a solid thing. The guards didn't enter. They flanked the doorway, their rifles pointed slightly downwards, their posture radiating a tension that was palpable even through my suit. One of them handed me a heavy-duty flashlight. My instructions were clear. I was to enter alone. This was my destination. This was the anomaly I had been sent to confront. The air that drifted out of the vault was ancient and cold, carrying a faint, dusty smell of decay and something else, something I couldn't place. A sterile, metallic scent, like the air after a lightning strike. I stood at the threshold, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the inside of my ribs. The beam of my flashlight cut a sharp, lonely cone into the waiting darkness. The road had ended, and I had the sickening feeling that this place, this cold and silent vault, had been waiting for me for a very, very long time. Stepping across that threshold was like stepping into another dimension. The oppressive silence of the corridor was nothing compared to the dead, sound-absorbent quiet inside the vault. The heavy door swung shut behind me with a final booming clang that sealed me inside, a sound of absolute finality. I was alone. The air inside, filtered through my suit, still carried that strange, sterile tang of ozone and old, decaying paper. The vault was small, no bigger than a large walk-in closet, and it was brutally functional. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with identical, featureless lead-gray metal boxes. Each one was sealed with a thick, waxy, dark red substance, like dried blood, and stenciled with a long, incomprehensible alphanumeric code. There was no dust. The place was unnaturally clean, as if the very air was too cold and too still to allow particles to settle. My flashlight beam, the only source of light, seemed to be swallowed by the matte gray surfaces, creating a disorienting lack of shadows. It felt like a place outside of time, a storeroom for things that the world had decided to forget. I held up the blue protocol card, my gloved hand shaking slightly. Designation 77 Alpha Niner. My own voice, tinny and artificial through the suit's internal comms, sounded like a desecration in the sacred quiet. I began a slow, methodical search, running my light along the stenciled codes, box after box, a library of forbidden knowledge. I passed 76B12, the file on the failed MK Ultra psychic driving experiments. I saw 81F45, the after-action reports from a disastrous cleanup operation at a crashed experimental aircraft site in the Congo. These were stories I knew, ghosts I was familiar with. They were dangerous, but they were known quantities. I continued my search, moving deeper into the vault, towards the back wall. The feeling of being watched was immense, a primal, irrational certainty that I was not alone, that the contents of these boxes were somehow aware of my presence. It was the feeling of a man walking through a zoo for nightmares. And then I saw it. In the far left corner, on the bottom shelf, almost completely hidden in shadow, was a box that was different from all the others. It was not gray. It was black. A flat, matte, light-devouring black that seemed to create its own small pocket of deeper darkness. It wasn't sealed with the standard red wax. It was bound with 3 heavy, rusted iron straps, each one fastened with a thick, archaic-looking padlock that looked like it belonged on a medieval dungeon door. It was an anomaly within an anomaly, a secret deemed too dangerous even for this tomb of secrets. My light fell upon the top of the box, and the breath caught in my throat, fogging my faceplate. Stenciled in stark, blocky white letters was a phrase that was not a designation. It was not a code. It was a warning. A warning so direct and so bizarre it sent a jolt of pure, undiluted fear through my system. 4 simple words. Acoustic hazard. Do not open. My blood ran cold. An acoustic hazard? A sound? In all my years as an analyst and all the bizarre and terrifying files I had processed, I had never encountered such a classification. Hazards were physical, radiological, biological, chemical, mimetic even. But acoustic? How could a sound, a mere recording, be classified as a physical danger on par with plutonium or a weaponized virus? It made no sense. It was a violation of established threat categories. This, I realized, was the true purpose of my mission. This was Carlson's test. He wanted to see what I would do when faced with something so far outside the bounds of normal procedure that the protocol itself became a paradox. The protocol said to verify the seal, but the box itself said not to open it. My mind raced. This was a loyalty test, a test of nerve, a test of obedience versus curiosity. And my curiosity, that fatal human flaw, was a roaring fire in my gut. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the hiss of my suit's respirator the only sound. The 2 armed guards were waiting for me on the other side of that door. Carlson was waiting for my report upstairs. And inside this black, iron-bound box, a secret was waiting. A secret so strange they had to invent a new way to label its danger. I made a decision. It was probably the single most fateful decision of my entire life. Following the obscure sub-protocols on the blue card for containment failure, I found a small, heavy toolkit bolted to the inside of the vault door. Inside, among other specialized tools, was a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. My hands, clumsy in the thick gloves, fumbled with the tool. It felt impossibly heavy. I knelt before the black box, a supplicant before a dark altar. I positioned the jaws of the cutters around the thick, rusted hasp of the first padlock. I squeezed the handles together. The metal groaned in protest, and then with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot in the tiny vault, the lock snapped and fell to the floor. The sound was a violation, a point of no return. I had broken the seal. I cut the other 2 locks, the sound of each one a hammer blow against the silence. With the locks gone, I unfastened the heavy iron straps, their rusted surfaces leaving red stains on my white gloves. The lid was now unsecured. I paused, my heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm. I placed my hands on the edges of the lid and lifted. It was far heavier than it should have been, as if magnetized to the box. With a final surge of effort, I broke it free. The air inside the box, a puff of captured time, washed over my suit. And I saw the contents. There was no complex device. There were no strange artifacts. There were only 3 things, nestled in a bed of thick, yellowed, crumbling foam. The first was a standard-issue green vinyl naval logbook, its cover slightly warped as if by moisture. The second was a stack of 8x10 black and white photographs, bound with a dry, rotted rubber band that had fused to the top print. And the third was a single 7-inch reel of magnetic tape, housed in a plain brown cardboard box. The label on the tape box was handwritten in a shaky but precise cursive. 2 words. Object Siren. I reached in and picked up the logbook. It was cold to the touch, a deep and unnatural cold that seemed to seep through my gloves. I opened it to the first page. The ink was a faded blue-black, the handwriting a neat, disciplined military-grade script. The entry was dated October 1st, 1967. Log entry 1. All systems green. SOSIS listening post. Argus is fully operational. The coffee is terrible. The silence is perfect. God, I'm bored. I felt a sudden, powerful wave of vertigo, a dizzying sense of falling backward through time. I was no longer an analyst in a vault. I was there, in that remote listening post, feeling the crushing weight of that perfect, terrible boredom, completely unaware of the sound that was, at that very moment, traveling up from the bottom of the world to shatter it forever. I had arrived. Back in the relative safety of my own small, windowless office, the black box sat on my desk like a coffin. The journey back up from level 4 had been a blur. I had sealed the evidence in a new secure transport case, passed it to the silent guards, and endured the long, silent elevator ride back to the world of fluorescent lights and circulating air. I signed the release forms, my hand still unsteady, and then I was alone. It was well past midnight. The vast machinery of the Pentagon was in its slumbering state, the endless corridors empty, the only sound a low, ever-present hum of the building's life support systems. But for me, the night had just begun. This was my first night with the Siren. The contents of the box were laid out before me on my steel desk, arranged like artifacts in a museum exhibit under the harsh, focused glare of my desk lamp. The logbook, the stack of photographs, and the reel of tape, which I had placed to the far side, a final frontier I was not yet ready to cross. I started with the logbook. I had to understand the context. I had to build the world before I could listen to its destruction. For the first hour, my reading was a study in profound, soul-crushing monotony. The log was a duet of boredom, played by two men stranded at the end of the world. The entries were written in two distinct hands, which I soon came to associate with the two souls trapped in that concrete box. The first belonged to Chief Petty Officer Frank Miller, a career Navy man, his handwriting a sharp, neat, almost architectural script. His entries were all business: weather reports, maintenance checks, terse observations about Soviet naval inactivity. October 3rd. Winds out of the northwest at 15 knots. Sea state moderate. Completed full diagnostic on hydrophone array at 0800 hours. All sensors performing within optimal parameters. No contacts of interest. The reds are either quiet or they're somewhere else. The silence is deafening. He was a man defined by procedure, a man who found comfort in order. The second hand belonged to Petty Officer Second Class James Jimmy Thompson. He was the young one, the audio technician with a poet's soul, and his handwriting was a looser, more rounded and expressive cursive. His entries were filled with the small human details of their isolation. October 3rd. Frank beat me at chess again. 3 games to 0. I swear the man is a machine. He never makes a mistake. Tried fishing off the rocks this afternoon, but the gulls stole my bait. The sky has been the same color of gray for a week. I think I'm starting to forget what the sun looks like. I'd kill for a real hamburger. They wrote about the tinned food they ate, the damp chill that seeped through the concrete walls and got into their bones. The same dozen paperback books they were rereading for the 5th time. It was a portrait of 2 men slowly being ground down by the sheer, empty weight of waiting. They were the watchmen on the wall, the ears of the free world, and their primary enemy was not the Soviet submarine fleet, but the relentless, grinding boredom of their own existence. I felt myself getting lulled by the rhythm of their routine, the predictable cadence of their days. I was becoming familiar with their small world, their inside jokes, their shared misery. I was setting my own baseline of normalcy, and then I turned a page and the baseline shattered. The entry was for October 17th, timed at 0300 hours. It was in Thompson's excited, spidery cursive. Routine sweep. Pick something up. It's on hydrophone 7, bearing 225. Source is deep. Very deep. Mariana's Trench deep. It's not right. It's not mechanical. Not a sub, not a ship. But it's not a whale either. Not any whale I've ever heard. It has structure. It's complex. It's singing. The final word was underlined 3 times. My own heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment of first contact. The moment the anomaly appeared. Miller's follow-up entry, logged 30 minutes later, was more clinical, but I could read the profound confusion between the lines of his rigid script. Confirm Thompson's contact. Source is biological but of unknown origin. Vocalization pattern is unlike any catalogued marine mammal. The complexity is an order of magnitude greater than a humpback whale song. It's structured, with repeating phrases and a consistent tonal center. It is, for lack of a better term, a melody. Logging as unidentified biological phenomenon, designation UBP-1. Am recording all transmissions and sending a flash report to Pearl Harbor Command. But it was Thompson's next entry, an hour after that truly sent a chill down my spine. It felt less like a log entry and more like a religious conversion. Frank thinks I'm losing my mind, but it's a song, a real song. It has a verse and a chorus and a bridge. It repeats every 13 hours, almost to the second. It lasts for precisely 11 minutes and then fades away into nothing. and it's the most beautiful, heartbreakingly sad thing I have ever heard in my entire life. It sounds like something is singing a lullaby at the bottom of the world. It's so beautiful it hurts to listen to it. I had to put the book down. I stood up and paced the small confines of my office. The hum of the building seemed to have gotten louder, more menacing. I was no longer just reading a file. I was a witness. I was in that room with them, feeling Thompson's awe and Miller's professional skepticism. This was the first night of the haunting. The unnatural sound had appeared. I looked at the reel of tape on my desk. It seemed to have a physical presence now, a weight. It was the fleeting glimpse of the entity itself, captured on a thin ribbon of magnetized plastic. I sat back down, compelled to continue, to see where this beautiful, terrible sound would lead them. The log entries for the next few days were a blur of obsessive, frantic scientific inquiry. They filled pages with hand-drawn spectrographs, with notes on the signal's frequency range, its decibel level, its uncanny mathematical purity. They argued about its purpose. Miller was convinced it was a new species, a biological marvel, the zoological discovery of the century. Thompson was convinced it was intelligent. "It's too perfect to be an animal," he wrote. "The harmonic overtones are mathematically pure. The structure is more complex than a Bach cantata. This isn't a mating call or a territorial warning. This is a broadcast. This is a message." The act, I knew, had to end on the cliffhanger that validated the fear, the moment the scientific curiosity curdled into something much darker. I found it a few pages later, in an entry from Miller, the steadfast skeptic, dated October 20th. His neat script was, for the first time, slightly shaky. "A strange development. For the past day, both Thompson and I have been experiencing moments of intense, unwarranted emotional distress. Sudden, powerful waves of nostalgia. A profound and painful homesickness. It seems to coincide with exposure to the signal. This is likely a psychological side effect of our prolonged isolation, but the correlation is troubling. The signal is no longer just beautiful. It's beginning to feel invasive." Driven by Miller's last unsettling entry, I felt a shift in my own purpose. I was no longer a passive reader. I was an investigator. The sun would be rising over Washington, D.C. in a few hours, but my small, sterile office was a timeless bubble of night. My only reality was the story laid out on my desk. I fell back on my training, my ingrained professional habits, as a way to keep my own rising fear at bay. I would conduct a systematic investigation, cross-referencing every piece of evidence, just as I had been trained to do. The central mystery was no longer what the signal was, but what it did. The investigation had turned from biology to psychology. I pushed the logbook aside for a moment and turned my attention to the second piece of evidence, the stack of 8x10 black and white photographs. The dry, rotted rubber band crumbled into black dust in my gloved fingers. I carefully separated the prints, which had stuck together with age and moisture. The first series of photos depicted the station itself, Sosis Post Argus. The images were stark and bleak. A low, brutalist concrete structure, half bunker, half tomb, perched precariously on a sliver of jagged black volcanic rock. The sea that surrounded it was a churning, angry gray, the sky a permanent oppressive sheet of overcast cloud. There were no trees. There was no sign of life other than a few distant seabirds, blurry specks against the gray sky. It was a portrait of absolute, profound isolation. The sheer despair of the location was a physical thing, even in a faded photograph. I could almost feel the cold, damp wind on my skin. I moved on to the interior shots. A cramped control room, packed wall to wall with the technological marvels of the 1960s. hulking reel-to-reel tape recorders, humming banks of amplifiers, the round green eyes of oscilloscopes, and a massive Collins radio transceiver. Wires snaked everywhere like thick, black vines. An overflowing ashtray sat on the console between two chairs. A small, functional galley with a 2-burner hot plate and shelves of tinned goods. A bunk room with 2 simple military-issue beds, each with a single, small, framed photograph on the wall above it. I couldn't make out the details of the photos, but I knew what they were. They were pictures of home. They were the talismans meant to ward off the crushing loneliness of this place. Then came the photographs of the men themselves. There was Chief Petty Officer Frank Miller squinting into the camera, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. His face was a roadmap of his life, weathered by sea salt and sun, his eyes narrowed in a permanent skeptical gaze. But looking closer, I could see the deep lines of exhaustion around them, the subtle sag of his shoulders. This was a man running on fumes and stubbornness. And then, Petty Officer James Thompson. He was younger, with a lopsided, almost goofy grin on his face, his hair unruly. In one photo, he was proudly holding up a large, ugly-looking fish he'd presumably caught. In another, he was sitting at the console, headphones on, a look of intense, almost rapturous concentration on his face as he adjusted a dial. He was the artist, the true believer. I found the photo of them playing chess, a plume of smoke from Miller's cigarette hanging in the air between them. They looked exactly like what they were. 2 profoundly different men, trapped in a box together, a million miles from everything they had ever known and loved. I began to cross-reference the photos with the logbook, and the story deepened. I read an entry from Thompson describing the hypnotic green line of the signal on the scope, and then I found the photo. It was a close-up of an oscilloscope screen, the focus slightly soft. A single, luminous green line was traced across it. But it wasn't the jagged, chaotic spike of noise or the simple sine wave of a test tone. It was a breathtakingly complex and elegant waveform, a series of perfect, symmetrical peaks and valleys that looked more like a piece of elaborate calligraphy or a work of art than a sound reading. It was beautiful, and it was deeply, unnervingly alien. Scrawled in grease pencil on the screen's casing right below the waveform was a single word: Siren. This was the first time they had given it the name. This was the moment it became a mythological beast. My investigation continued, page by page, photo by photo. The near misses the prompt described were not physical events in my office, but the escalating record of psychological decay in the logbook. I felt like I was watching them from a great distance, powerless to intervene as the entity toyed with them. I read Miller's entry about feeling a sudden, irrational urge to check the comms link to Pearl Harbor, and I felt a phantom anxiety in my own chest. I read Thompson's entry about dreaming of his dead dog, and I found myself thinking about my own childhood pet, a memory I hadn't accessed in decades, the thought appearing unbidden in my mind. The file was becoming contagious. The dread was leaking out of the pages. The investigation led me, inevitably, to the final frantic pages of the log. The systematic scientific inquiry had completely dissolved, replaced by raw, emotional agony. The log was no longer a record of events. It was a record of 2 minds being systematically and cruelly dismantled. They weren't just homesick anymore. The signal was actively weaponizing their own memories against them, turning their most cherished loves into instruments of torture. I found the pages filled with their home addresses, written over and over. Miller, 1247, Cuesta Verde Drive, San Diego, California. 1247, Cuesta Verde Drive. Thompson, Route 3, Box 88, Bend, Oregon. Route 3, Box 88. The handwriting deteriorated with each repetition, from neat script to a desperate looping scrawl, the pen digging so hard into the paper that it tore through in places. It was a mantra against madness, an anchor to a reality that was slipping away from them. And then I reached the final cliffhanger, the culmination of my investigation. The final 2 entries, both dated October 27th. They explained the what, but not the how. The first was from Thompson. His cursive, which had become almost illegible, was suddenly calm and clear again, as if he had reached a place of serene acceptance. Frank was right all along. They are calling for us. I can hear my mom. She says she's holding the door open for me. She says dinner is ready. I can smell the pot roast. She's waiting just outside. My blood ran cold. The final entry in the entire logbook was from Chief Petty Officer Frank Miller, the tough, by-the-book Navy man. His blocky printing was reduced to a shaky, almost childish scrawl, a testament to his complete and utter breakdown. It was not an observation. It was not a log. It was a declaration of intent. 4 final, terrible words. Going home. Finally, going home. That was it. The written record ended. My investigation had revealed the tragic, insane conclusion. But the most important piece of evidence, the central artifact, the murder weapon itself, still sat untouched on my desk. The tape. The investigation was over. The trial was about to begin. I, the sole juror, sat in judgment of the last piece of evidence, the reel of tape. It sat on the far corner of my desk, a small, unassuming object that now seemed to possess a gravitational pull, bending the light in the room around it. Everything in my training, every instinct for self-preservation that had been drilled into me by the clandestine world I inhabited, screamed at me to stop, to put the logbook, the photographs, and the tape back into the black box, to seal it with the new, tamper-proof tape I had been issued, to write a simple, boring report stating the contents were degraded and of no value, and to send it back to the tomb of Level 4. That was the smart play. That was the survival play. But it was no longer possible. I had read their final words. I had seen the serene, blissful look on their faces as they walked out into the storm. I could not file away the cause of their deaths without understanding it. It would have been the ultimate act of intellectual cowardice. I owed it to Miller. I owed it to Thompson. I had to hear the song that had called them home. My office, a sterile cube of government efficiency, was not equipped with a reel-to-reel player. The technology was already obsolete by 1983. Clunky analog dinosaurs in a world rapidly embracing the digital. They had been relegated to the audio-visual archives, a dusty, underfunded department in another wing of the building, 2 floors down. Getting my hands on one at this hour of the morning, without logging an official request and raising 1,000 red flags, would be a challenge. But I was an archivist, a librarian of secrets. I knew the building's hidden pathways, its forgotten corners. I knew which storage closets held obsolete equipment, which departments were ghost towns after 6 p.m. I felt like a spy in my own life, a burglar in my own workplace. I packed the tape, the logbook, and the photos back into the secure transport case. Its weight felt immense, a physical burden of the knowledge it contained. I slipped out of my office, my leather-soled shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum of the deserted corridor. The silence of the Pentagon at night is a unique and unsettling thing. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a great beast asleep. Its lungs the vast air circulation systems, its heartbeat the low, subaudible thrum of the emergency generators in the deep basements. Every flicker of the fluorescent lights, every distant groan of the building's ancient plumbing, felt amplified, sinister. I kept glancing over my shoulder down the long, empty hallways, half expecting to see the silhouette of Carlson standing there, his face a mask of disappointment. or worse, of knowing complicity. I found what I was looking for in a media lab on the second sublevel. It was a room that time had forgotten, filled with the ghosts of old technology. Bulky videotape machines, editing bays with controllers the size of briefcases, and, in the corner, covered in a thin film of gray dust, a studio-grade Ampex ATR 102. It was a magnificent piece of analog engineering, a beautiful, hulking machine built to last an eternity. It was a dinosaur, but it was a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I gently wiped the dust from its surface with the sleeve of my jacket. I plugged it in, and with a soft, satisfying hum, its vacuum tubes began to glow with a warm orange light, like embers being brought back to life. This was the moment of truth. My hands were slick with sweat inside my gloves as I took the reel of tape out of its plain cardboard box. It looked so ordinary, so harmless. A thin, brown ribbon of magnetized plastic wound around a simple 7-inch spool. An acoustic hazard. I carefully, meticulously, threaded the tape through the machine's complex series of polished steel guides and rubber pinch rollers. My fingers, usually so nimble, felt clumsy and thick. The source reel felt impossibly heavy with the weight of its recording. The take-up reel was empty and waiting. In a drawer beneath the console, I found a pair of high-fidelity Sennheiser headphones, the big, bulky kind that sound engineers cherish, with thick, padded cups that seal completely around your ears, creating a small, isolated world of pure sound. I plugged their heavy, coiled cord into the machine's monitor jack. I sat down in the old, cracked vinyl swivel chair, which let out a loud creak of protest, a sound that made me jump. I took a deep, shuddering breath, held it in my lungs, and with a trembling finger I pressed the large triangular play button. For the first 5 seconds there was nothing but the soft, gentle hiss of the magnetic tape itself passing over the playback head. It was the sound of empty time, the sound of silence recorded in 1967. I could hear my own heart, a frantic, thudding rhythm against my eardrums. My whole world contracted to the space between the two headphone cups. And then, it began. It didn't start with a sound. It started with an absence of sound. The tape hiss, the background noise of the universe, simply vanished. It was cut off, as if a door had been slammed shut, plunging me into a silence so absolute, so profound, that it felt like the pressure in my ears was dropping. It was the sound of the bottom of the ocean. And out of that perfect, black, velvety void, the first note emerged. It wasn't a sound that entered my ears. It was a vibration that seemed to originate in the center of my own skull. A low, impossibly pure, resonant tone that bloomed in the darkness like a single, phosphorescent flower. It held for a long, aching moment. And then it was joined by another note, a perfect fifth above it, their frequencies locking together to create a harmony that was both mathematically precise and emotionally devastating. A third note joined, then a fourth, building a chord that seemed to contain all the sorrow and all the beauty of existence. It was the sound of a star being born and dying in the same instant. It was the sound of a cathedral being built in an abyss. Thompson had been right. It was a melody. It was a structured, layered, and intelligently designed piece of music. It had none of the random, chaotic, or repetitive elements of an animal call. It was deliberate. It was art. The composition was a fluid, ever-evolving tapestry of sound, a series of ascending and descending phrases that seemed to mimic the gentle rise and fall of a deep, slow, cosmic breath. The sound itself. I have no words in the English language to adequately describe it. It was like the resonant hum of a cello the size of a mountain, played by a god. It was like the chime of a crystal bell struck once in a vacuum, its tone sustaining for an eternity. It was like the ethereal, wordless choir of 1,000 voices singing in a key that human vocal cords could never hope to produce. It was, without exaggeration, the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard in my entire life. And it was a weapon. As I listened, paralyzed in the chair, the sheer unearthly beauty of the music began to work on me. It bypassed the analytical, critical part of my brain entirely. It ignored the locks on the doors of my memory. It went straight for the heart. I felt a wave of powerful emotion wash over me, so potent it was like a physical drug, a deep, aching melancholy, a sense of profound cosmic loneliness, the feeling of being the last living thing in the universe. And then, the homesickness began. It started as a faint whisper, a fleeting, sun-drenched image that flickered at the edge of my consciousness. The specific pattern of the peeling green paint on the back door of my childhood home in Ohio. The exact, unique scent of the floral wallpaper in my grandmother's kitchen. A mixture of old paper, dust, and cinnamon. The smell of burning leaves in the crisp autumn air of my old neighborhood. A smell I hadn't encountered in 20 years. Small, forgotten, deeply personal details, bubbling up from the deepest wells of my memory with a clarity that was staggering and painful. The music swelled, becoming more complex, more insistent, more demanding, and the feelings intensified with it. This was no longer a gentle, wistful nostalgia. It was a physical pain, a crushing, unbearable weight on my chest, an ache in my soul so profound it brought hot, shameful tears to my eyes. The Siren was rummaging through my memories, pulling them out one by one and showing them to me. I saw my father's face, not as the frail old man he was when he died, but young and strong and vibrant, his face beaming with pride as he taught me to ride my first two-wheeled bicycle down our cracked and uneven sidewalk. I could feel the phantom sensation of his strong, calloused hand on my back, steadying me. I could hear his voice, a perfect, vivid, three-dimensional echo in my mind. "That's it, son. You got it. Don't look down. I'm right here." The tears were streaming down my face now, dripping from my chin onto the front of my shirt. I was sobbing, not with sadness, but with the sheer, agonizing pain of loss, the unbearable distance between that perfect sunlit memory and the cold, dark room I was in. I knew, with a terrifying and absolute certainty, that this was what Miller and Thompson had felt. This was the Siren's song. This beautiful, terrible weapon that took the purest, most powerful love a human being can feel. The love for your home, for your family, for your past, and twisted it into an instrument of exquisite psychological torture. It made you feel so utterly lost, so profoundly, cosmically alone, that the only logical solution, the only possible relief from the agony, was to go back, at any cost. I wanted to rip the headphones from my head. I wanted to stand up and smash the humming, glowing machine to pieces with my chair, but I was completely paralyzed. The music held me in its velvet grip. It was too beautiful to stop listening. It was the experience of a man dying of thirst in the desert being offered a single, perfect glass of the purest, coldest water, and knowing with absolute certainty that it was laced with cyanide. I was weeping openly now, my body shaking with deep, uncontrollable sobs in the empty, silent room. The images were coming faster and faster, a kaleidoscopic montage of every happy memory I'd ever possessed, each one now tainted, weaponized, imbued with the unbearable agony of its own passing. It was a symphony of grief, composed just for me. And then, precisely at the 11-minute mark, just as the logbook had described, the music reached its final, soaring crescendo. A single, magnificent, multi-layered chord that seemed to encompass every note that had come before it, a sound that seemed to hang in the silent void for an eternity. And as that final, beautiful note began to slowly, gently fade, a new sound entered the recording, a harsh, grating, metallic screech. The unmistakable sound of the heavy, circular steel hatch of the listening post being unlatched. It was followed by a sudden, violent roar, the sound of the Pacific storm they had described, a chaotic maelstrom of howling wind and the percussive crash of massive waves against rock. The pristine, sterile, beautiful recording was suddenly invaded by the raw, untamed chaos of the real world. I could hear faint, indistinct shouts lost in the gale, the voices of Miller and Thompson too distorted by the wind to make out their words. And then, right at the moment the security camera photos showed them stepping out into the storm, the tape cut. It wasn't a fade to black. It was an abrupt, violent severing of the connection. A loud, painful click. One moment, the roaring heart of the storm. The next, nothing but the flat, empty, meaningless hiss of a blank, unrecorded tape. The siren had finished its song, and the line had gone dead. The silence that followed was more deafening than the song itself. I tore the headphones from my head and threw them onto the console, the plastic clattering loudly. I was gasping for air like a drowning man, my face drenched in tears and sweat, my heart hammering a painful, irregular tattoo against my ribs. I stumbled back from the Ampex machine, my legs weak and unsteady, and leaned against a cold metal shelving unit to keep from falling. I had heard it, the acoustic hazard, the siren, and I understood. I understood completely in a way that reading the logbook could never convey. The signal didn't kill them with sound waves or radiation. It killed them with love. It dismantled their minds with nostalgia, convinced them that their own cherished memories were a siren call from beyond the grave, and that death was not an end, but a doorway home. It was the most elegant and most cruel murder weapon I could possibly imagine. I don't know how long I stood there shaking in the dusty, silent media lab, the ghost of that melody still echoing in the traumatized pathways of my brain. A part of me knew I was at a crossroads. I held in my hands, in this transport case, definitive proof of an impossible, terrifying truth. I could become a whistleblower. I could take this story, this tape, to the handful of journalists I knew who might have the courage to print it. I could try to tell the world about the song at the bottom of the ocean. Or I could do what I was paid to do. I could put the ghost back in its machine. I could seal the box, write a sanitized bureaucratic fiction of a report, and bury Object Siren so deep in the archives that no one would ever find it again. My survival instinct, the ingrained paranoia that was a necessary part of my profession, took over with the cold, clear logic of a chess computer. Telling the world would be a form of professional and possibly literal suicide. They wouldn't believe me. I'd be branded a crank, a charlatan, or worse, a traitor, leaking classified information. And I would simply disappear. Not into a prison, but into a quiet, comfortable oblivion. The machine I worked for was too big, too powerful. It did not tolerate loose ends or inconvenient truths. With a heart that felt as heavy as lead, I rewound the tape, the soft whirring of the machine, an obscenely normal sound after what I just experienced. I carefully packed the logbook, the photographs, and the reel of tape back into the black containment box. I wiped my fingerprints from every surface I had touched in the media lab. I returned the headphones to their drawer. I left the room exactly as I had found it. I was already beginning the cover-up. The journey back to my office was a walk through a nightmare. The long, empty corridors of the Pentagon no longer seemed merely silent. They seemed watchful, Every shadow seemed to stretch towards me. Every distant hum of machinery sounded like a whisper. The psychological assault had begun. The siren, I was beginning to realize, had not ended when the tape did. It had planted a seed in my mind, a resonant frequency that was still vibrating deep inside me. I made it back to my office and locked the door. I sat at my desk, the black box before me, and I tried to ground myself in reality. But reality was becoming unstable. I kept hearing things. The faint, phantom sound of a cello. A single mournful note played just at the edge of my hearing. I thought I heard my father's voice. A single, clear word. "Son," whispered right behind me. I spun around in my chair, my heart leaping into my throat. The room was empty. Of course, it was empty. "It's just your mind," I told myself. "It's the after effect of the recording. An auditory hallucination. Perfectly normal under the circumstances." But the feeling of dread didn't subside. I felt a profound, irrational guilt. The same guilt Miller had described in the log. Guilt for being so far from home, even though my home was only a 20-minute drive away. Guilt for being in this sterile, cold office instead of with my wife, asleep in our warm bed. I finally left the building as the first pale gray light of dawn was breaking over the city. The drive home was surreal. The world looked wrong. The colors seemed too bright, the edges of buildings too sharp. The faces of the other early morning commuters I passed looked like masks, their expressions empty and alien. The war was escalating. The signal was no longer just attacking my past. It was attacking my present, warping my perception of the world around me. When I got home, my wife, Helen, was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "Arlen, what on earth? I was worried sick. You didn't call." I tried to form a reply to say I had to work late, the usual easy lie. But the words wouldn't come. I was looking at her face, the face I loved, the face I had known for 10 years, and suddenly I was overwhelmed by a vivid, full sensory hallucination. I was no longer in my kitchen in Arlington, Virginia. I was standing on the cracked sidewalk of my childhood street in Ohio. It was summer. I was 7 years old, and my father was kneeling in front of me, his hands on my shoulders, his face a mask of disappointment. "You let go of the handlebars, son," he was saying, his voice full of a terrible, sad weight. "I told you not to let go. You have to hold on. Why did you let go?" It was a memory of falling off my bike, a trivial, forgotten moment from 30 years ago. But the siren had found it and turned it into a waking nightmare. The feeling of shame, of failure, of letting him down, was as real and as sharp as it had been on that summer day. I must have made some sound, a whimper or a gasp, because Helen's expression changed from irritation to alarm. "Arlen, are you okay? You're as white as a sheet." I blinked and the kitchen snapped back into focus. My father was gone, but the feeling, the cold, terrible feeling of failure and shame, remained. I lashed out, the emotional pain so intense I had to make it physical. "Just leave me alone, Helen!" I snarled, my voice a harsh, ugly sound I didn't recognize as my own. Just, for once, stop hovering over me. I saw the hurt and confusion flash in her eyes. I had never, not once in our entire marriage, spoken to her that way. I turned away from her, unable to bear the look on her face, and my hand swept out and knocked a ceramic vase off the kitchen counter. It was a vase her mother had given us for our wedding. It shattered on the tile floor with a loud, final crash. The sound broke the spell. I stood there, breathing heavily, looking at the broken pieces of porcelain scattered across the floor, and I realized what I had done. I had brought the monster home. It wasn't in the box anymore. It was in me. And it was trying to break everything I loved. The crash of the shattering vase was followed by a profound and terrible silence. It was a silence thicker and more suffocating than any I had experienced in the archives or the media lab. It was the silence of a catastrophic, irreversible mistake. Helen didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, looking at the scattered blue and white fragments of the vase on the floor, then up at me, her face a pale, unreadable mask. The hurt I had seen in her eyes a moment before had been replaced by something far worse, a calm, clinical fear. The look you would give to a stranger who had just broken into your house, the look you would give to something you no longer recognized. I had broken the seal, not on a vault door in the Pentagon, but on the delicate, carefully constructed trust of my own marriage. The containment had been breached, and the anomaly was loose in my home. I'm sorry, I stammered, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I don't know why I'm just tired. It was a pathetic, flimsy excuse, and we both knew it. The damage was done. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, her eyes never leaving my face. I think I'm going to go and stay with my sister for a few days, Arlen, she said, her voice unnaturally steady, devoid of all emotion. I think you need some space. You need to sort yourself out. She walked past me, giving me a wide berth as if I were radioactive, and went upstairs. A few minutes later, I heard the soft click of a suitcase latch, and then her footsteps descending the stairs. She didn't look at me as she walked out the front door, closing it softly behind her. The sound of her car starting in the driveway and pulling away was the sound of my world ending. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time, with the thing that was living in my head. The point of no return had been crossed. The days that followed were a descent into a private, self-inflicted hell. With Helen gone, the house was no longer a home. It was just a structure, a container for my growing paranoia and fear. The profound silence she left behind was a canvas onto which the Siren could now paint its masterpieces. The phantom sounds grew more frequent, more insistent. I would hear whispers in the static of the television. I would hear the faint, heartbreaking melody of the siren carried on the wind outside my window at night. The psychological games escalated into a form of overt physical aggression, but the aggression was all my own. I was the entity throwing things across the room. I became convinced there were microphones in the walls, cameras in the light fixtures. In a fit of paranoid rage, I took a hammer and smashed every telephone in the house, then tore the television from the wall and threw it into the backyard. I was systematically severing my own last links to the outside world, just as Miller and Thompson had been severed from theirs. The direct, violent encounter with the anomaly was a battle I fought with myself in the bathroom mirror. I would stand there, staring at my own reflection, and I would see my face distort, my eyes becoming dark, hollow pits. I saw Miller's face looking back at me, his expression one of weary accusation. I saw Thompson's face, his youthful grin twisted into a terrifying, knowing smirk. The entity was no longer a ghost in the machine. It was a tangible force in my world because it was a tangible force in my mind. The secondary characters in my life, my friends, my colleagues, died a quiet death. I didn't return their calls. I called in sick to work, claiming a severe case of the flu. I was burning my life to the ground, one bridge at a time, driven by a terror I could not name and could not explain to anyone. I barely ate. I drank. I sat in the darkened living room for hours, the shattered vase still on the floor, a monument to my failure, and I listened to the silence, waiting for the song to start again. After what must have been a week of this self-imposed exile, I hit rock bottom. I was sitting on the floor of my study, the room in disarray, empty bottles scattered around me. The sun was setting, filling the room with long, melancholy shadows. I felt a wave of despair so profound, so absolute, that for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I understood the final, serene logic of Miller and Thompson. I understood the desire to simply walk away from the pain. The thought of my own front door, of the quiet street outside, of just walking until my legs gave out, felt tempting. It felt like peace. The siren's call was at its strongest, whispering its sweet, lethal promise of an end to the agony. And in that moment of complete and utter despair, something else happened. A tiny, flickering ember of defiance sparked to life in the cold, dead ashes of my mind. It was the analyst in me, the problem solver, the man who looked at chaos and tried to find a pattern. The entity, this signal, it had cornered me. It had taken my wife, my job, my sanity. It had taken everything. And in the silent, dust-mote-filled air of my ruined study, I realized there was only one thing left to do. I wasn't going to run anymore. I wasn't going to let it break me. I was going to the source. But the source wasn't at the bottom of the ocean. The source was in that black box. I wasn't going to bury it. I was going to dissect it. I was going to turn it off. The decision to fight back was like a dam breaking in my mind. The crippling despair that had paralyzed me for days was replaced by a cold, sharp, and focused rage. This was no longer a haunting. This was a war, and my mind was the battlefield. The first step was to prepare for the final confrontation, to arm myself for the descent into the lair. The lair was not a physical place. It was the signal itself. It was the 11 minutes of recorded sound on that reel of tape. And my weapons would not be guns or explosives, but knowledge. I began by cleaning up my life, or what was left of it. I gathered the empty bottles and threw them out. I swept up the shattered remains of the vase, each fragment a small, sharp reminder of my failure. I showered, shaved, and put on clean clothes for the first time in a week. I was a soldier preparing for a suicide mission, and I would face my enemy with some small measure of dignity. My study became my command center, my gauntlet. I drove to a specialty electronics store in the city, a place that catered to audiophiles and studio engineers, and I used the last of the money in my checking account to purchase the tools I would need. I bought a used reel-to-reel tape machine, a simpler model than the Ampex, but one I could operate at home. I bought a high-resolution audio interface to digitize the signal, a spectrum analyzer, and a set of professional-grade studio monitors. I then went to the university library and checked out every book I could find on psychoacoustics, marine biology, musical theory, and the physics of sound waves. I was gathering my meager weapons, patching the wounds in my resolve, and steeling myself for what I knew would be a series of agonizing descents back into the heart of the siren's song. The journey into the lair was a terrifying, repetitive gauntlet. Each time I played the tape, it was a fresh assault. The entity, the signal, actively tried to stop me. The moment the first note bloomed from the speakers, the war for my sanity began anew. The crushing homesickness would wash over me. The phantom memories would flicker at the edges of my vision. The profound, suicidal despair would settle like a cold, wet blanket on my soul. But this time, I was not a passive victim. I was fighting back. I would ground myself in the physical world, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles were white. I would recite my name, my real name, and my address, not as a desperate prayer like Miller and Thompson, but as a declaration of my existence, a shield against the signal's psychic erosion. I would focus on the data, forcing my mind to see the signal not as a song, but as a waveform on the spectrum analyzer, a series of numbers and frequencies. I was trying to deconstruct the ghost, to reduce the god to a set of equations. The very architecture of my mind became hostile and surreal during these sessions. Corridors of memory would loop back on themselves. The gravity of my own emotions would shift, pulling me down into pits of grief. But I held on. For weeks, I descended into that 11-minute hell over and over again, for hours every day. I listened to the tape at different speeds. I analyzed the frequency spectrum of every single note. I mapped the harmonic overtones, which were impossibly complex and pure. I was looking for a flaw, a mistake, a crack in its perfect, beautiful facade. And in the third week of my obsessive analysis, I faced the final guardian. I found the puzzle that required cleverness, not just endurance. While studying the spectrograph printouts, I noticed something that was almost invisible. Behind the primary, powerful melody, there was a second, much fainter signal, a carrier wave of sorts, buried deep in the subharmonic frequencies, almost at the very limit of human hearing. It was a simple, repeating pattern of 5 low-frequency pulses. It was the signal's backbone, its engine. Using the audio editing software, I was able to isolate this carrier wave and filter out the beautiful, distracting melody that lay on top of it. It was like separating the puppet from the puppeteer's strings. I played the isolated carrier wave back. It was not a song. It was a low, unsettling, rhythmic thrumming, a sound that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn. But it held none of the emotional, memory-evoking power of the full signal. The siren's voice was gone. I had disarmed it. And then, I had an idea. A desperate, crazy idea, born of sleep deprivation and sheer obsession. What if the carrier wave was a key? What if it was a language? I remembered a detail from Miller's log, an entry I had initially dismissed as irrelevant. In the first few days of their contact, he had noted that the signal seemed to cause a slight, anomalous power fluctuation in the station's main generator, a rhythmic dip in the voltage that perfectly matched the tempo of the song. It was a puzzle that required specific knowledge gleaned from the central artifact. On a hunch, I took the 5-pulse sequence from the carrier wave and converted it from a sound into a number, using its frequency and duration. The result was a long, complex numerical code. I stared at it, my heart pounding. It felt like a key. But a key to what? I combed through the logbook again, page by page, looking for anything that might correspond to it, and I found it. Tucked away in a technical appendix at the back of the book was a list of the station's emergency diagnostic and reboot codes for the main hydrophone array computer. And there it was. One of the codes, for a deep system reset, was a near-perfect match for the number I had generated from the carrier wave. I felt a dizzying, terrifying wave of understanding wash over me. I had reached the final door. This was the moment of revelation. The final barrier was not a vault door or a containment shield. It was a single, horrifying idea that was beginning to form in my mind. The code wasn't for turning something off. It was for turning something on. I took a final, shuddering breath, the air in my study suddenly feeling thin and cold. I looked at the logbook, at my printouts, at the silent tape machine. The door was open. The air that hit me was cold, ancient, and smelled of ozone and the deep, dark, crushing pressure of the abyss. And what I saw inside, God. No report, no recording could ever prepare a person for that. The lair was not a physical place. It was a schematic. It was a blueprint for a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. My study, walls now covered in spectrograph printouts, complex equations, and pages torn from the logbook, had become the chamber where the monster was finally being dissected. My rich, detailed, and terrifying description of the entity's true form was not a visual one, but an intellectual one. I sat at my desk, a single lamp cutting a harsh circle of light in the pre-dawn gloom, and I began to write. I was writing the report that no one, not even Carlson, would ever see. The true report. The entity, object Siren, was not a creature. It was a broadcast, but it was not an alien broadcast. It was far, far worse. It was a piece of sophisticated, targeted bioacoustic engineering. It operated on a principle we were only just beginning to understand in the 1980s. Resonant frequency brainwave entrainment. The beautiful, complex melody was merely the delivery system, the sugar that coated the poison. Its true purpose was to lull the listener's brain into a state of heightened emotional receptivity. The real weapon was the carrier wave I had discovered, the low-frequency pulse. That rhythmic thrumming was precisely calibrated to resonate with the hippocampus and the amygdala, the parts of the human brain responsible for long-term memory and emotional response. It didn't just make you remember home. It physically induced the neurological and chemical state of profound, agonizing nostalgia. It triggered a massive, unnatural release of cortisol and acetylcholine in the listener's brain, creating a state of intense, painful grief, while simultaneously stimulating the dopamine receptors associated with the pleasure of those same memories. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop of agony and ecstasy. It created a pain so unbearable that the only escape the brain could conceive was to physically return to the source of the happy memories, to go home. It didn't drive you crazy. It made you so exquisitely, rationally miserable that suicide, reframed by the brain as going home, became the only logical solution. It was a weapon that turned a person's own love for their life into the mechanism of their death. The ultimate confrontation was not a psychic duel or a battle of wills. It was the simple, arduous act of me, Arlen Hayes, sitting in that room, forcing myself to withstand the full, unfiltered presence of the signal's echo in my mind, while I clinically laid out its terrifying mechanics on paper. It was a battle against my own weeping soul, a fight to maintain scientific objectivity, while every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, to give in to the sweet, sad promise of going home. And it was during this final, agonizing process of documentation that I stumbled upon the last devastating piece of the puzzle, the final revelation that turned the entire story on its head. I was rereading Miller's notes on the anomalous power fluctuations in the station's generator, and I noticed something I had missed a dozen times before. A small, parenthetical note next to a voltage reading. It said, "Post-broadcast resonance test, number 7, output nominal. Post-broadcast, not post-reception." The word hit me like a physical blow. I frantically searched the rest of the technical appendices, my hands shaking. I was looking for a ghost, a hidden clue, and I found it. A calibration note for hydrophone 7, the one that first picked up the signal. It wasn't calibrated for passive listening. It was calibrated for active, high-energy, low-frequency transmission. SOSUS listening post. Argus wasn't just a listening post. It was a transmitter. They weren't just the ears of the Navy. They were a voice. The terrible, world-shattering truth fell into place. The project didn't fail. It horribly, catastrophically succeeded. They weren't trying to listen for Soviet submarines with that transmitter. They were taking part in a deeply classified, wildly ambitious ONI DARPA project. Project Orpheus, I would later learn it was called. An attempt to achieve long-range communication through the Earth's mantle, using the deep ocean trenches as a natural resonant chamber. They were broadcasting a complex coded signal into the deepest part of the planet. And the siren was the echo. It was their own signal, bounced back, amplified, and horribly, unimaginably mutated by whatever it had passed through or whatever it had woken up. down there in the crushing, eternal darkness. The reboot code I had found wasn't for turning the hydrophone array on. It was the activation code for the broadcast itself. Miller and Thompson weren't the first victims of a random alien signal. They were the creators of their own monster. They rang the dinner bell, not by listening, but by shouting into the abyss. And the abyss had shouted back in a voice they could understand all too well. Armed with this final, terrible knowledge, I knew what I had to do. My final, sacrificial act would not be to overload a reactor or trigger a self-destruct. It would be an act of bureaucratic horror. It would be an act of silence. To reveal this truth, that a secret US Navy experiment had created a signal that could drive its own personnel to suicide, would be catastrophic. It would be a scandal of unimaginable proportions. It would lead to congressional hearings, to panic, to a witch hunt. And worse, it would lead to other people trying to replicate the experiment, trying to weaponize the Siren. My sacrifice was to kill the truth, to protect the world from a song it should never, ever hear. I spent the rest of the night writing my official report, the one I would give to Carlson. It was a masterpiece of fiction. I described the contents of the box as badly degraded hydrophone logs from a decommissioned station. I claimed the tape was mostly static, the logbook water-damaged and illegible. I recommended, due to the compromised nature of the materials and their lack of any intelligence value, that File 77A9 be slated for immediate and permanent destruction by incineration. I was condemning Miller and Thompson to be forgotten forever, their deaths officially ruled an accident. I was sacrificing their memory to protect the future. At dawn, I placed my real report, the true story of the Siren, into a small metal box, and I sealed it. My own private tomb of a secret. The final act was to drive back to the Pentagon, to walk those long, silent corridors, and to stand before Arthur Carlson. I handed him my fabricated report. I watched him read it, his face the usual impassive gray stone. He looked up at me, his eyes holding mine for a long, silent moment. And in that moment, I knew that he knew. He knew I was lying. He knew I had looked too deep. But I had come to the correct conclusion. I had chosen silence. I had chosen to be a good soldier. My final action, the peak of the story, was not a blinding flash of light or a deafening roar. It was his single, quiet, dismissive nod. "Good work, analyst," he grunted. The words a death sentence for my career, and a final binding seal on the tomb of Object Siren. That will be all. The silence that followed Carlson's dismissal was the silence of a successful execution. My career, my future, my very identity within the machine had been terminated, not with a bang, but with a quiet, administrative nod. I was no longer an analyst. I was a loose end, and now I was being neatly tied off. The immediate aftermath was disorienting, a slow-motion awakening into a new, stranger life. I wasn't dragged from my office or sent to a black site. The bureaucratic horror was far more subtle, more chillingly professional. My disoriented awakening wasn't from a physical blast, but from the slow, creeping realization of my own erasure. I came into work the next Monday, and my keycard no longer opened the door to my office. When I went to security, the guard looked at my ID, typed my name into his computer, and frowned. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, not meeting my eyes. "There's no record of an Arlen Hayes with this clearance level." I was a ghost. My debriefing, my exit interview they called it, took place 2 days later in a featureless off-site location. A corporate-looking office in a bland glass building in Rosslyn that probably didn't exist on any official government ledger. The room had no windows. The walls were a soft, institutional gray. A single, heavy wooden table sat in the center, and on the other side of it sat two men. They weren't soldiers or spies in the traditional sense. They were lawyers, bureaucrats, the system's quiet janitors. One was older, with thin gray hair and wearing an expensive but rumpled suit. The other was younger, sharper, his eyes cold and intelligent. They introduced themselves with names I knew were fake. Their questions were not about the Siren or the tape or what I had heard. They never once mentioned Post Argus or Miller or Thompson. Their questions were clinical, chillingly human, and focused entirely on me. They asked about my health, my marriage, my financial situation. They knew Helen had left. They knew about my recent purchases at the electronics store. They knew everything. Their threats were never spoken aloud. They were veiled, buried in the subtext of their polite, professional inquiries. They spoke of the generous early retirement package the Navy was offering me for my years of loyal and discreet service. They spoke of the importance of moving on, of letting go of the past. They were not interested in the truth I had uncovered. They were only interested in the containment of that truth. And the primary vessel of that containment was me. They gave me a new name, a new social security number, a new life history. They created Arlen Hayes, a retired university historian specializing in maritime trade routes, a man with a quiet past and no connections to the intelligence community. They handed me a thick folder containing my new identity, my new life, laid out in pristine, freshly printed documents. It was my own personal file, 77A9. The older man slid it across the table. "You've had a stressful few years, Mr. Hayes," he said, using my new name for the first time. It felt alien, a suit of clothes that didn't fit. The best thing for you now is to forget, to put your old work behind you. Find a quiet place. Read books. Don't dwell on things that are no longer your concern. It wouldn't be healthy. There it was, the quiet, unspoken threat, the final turn of the key in the lock of my new prison. I walked out of that building into the bright afternoon sun, a free man who was in reality a prisoner for life. My own mind the solitary confinement cell, my silence the bars on the window. And now I jump forward, 40 years, to the present day, to this quiet house at the end of this quiet road, to me, an old man talking into a cheap cassette recorder, the scars of that one assignment still etched onto my soul. The psychological toll has been immense. The paranoia never truly left. For years, I would check my phone for a dial tone before making a call. I would scan the street for parked cars that seemed out of place. I couldn't form relationships. My marriage to Helen was over. The man she had married had died in that media lab, and the ghost that came back was someone she couldn't live with. We never reconciled. I saw my daughter on weekends, then holidays, then not at all. How do you explain to your family that you are haunted by a sound? How do you describe a song that makes you want to die? So you don't. You just drift away. You become a ghost in your own life, a polite, distant stranger at family gatherings. Your mind always somewhere else, back in that cold, silent vault, or in that lonely concrete room with two men listening to the end of the world. I have lived my life with a constant low-level hum of static in the back of my mind, a faint echo of the Siren's song, a constant reminder that a part of my brain was permanently retuned to a frequency that no longer belongs to me. It's a specific kind of tinnitus, a ringing in the soul that never, ever stops. I have one final thing to add before I turn this recording off. I've told you this story, not for fame, not for revenge, and certainly not for forgiveness. I've told it because of what I heard on the radio last Tuesday. I don't know if the Siren is active again. I don't know if it was ever truly gone. But I know that we, in our arrogance, in our endless questing ambition, once shouted into the abyss, And the abyss answered us in a language we could understand, the language of loss, of grief, of home. We created a weapon that targets the very core of our humanity, the love that binds us to our own lives. And the most terrifying secret of all, the one I have kept buried deepest for all these years, is not that the Siren exists, but that the technology to create it, to broadcast that carrier wave, to weaponize nostalgia, is sitting in a file, in a vault somewhere. The schematics for Project Orpheus. That is the true acoustic hazard. The knowledge. I've lived my life in the shadow of that knowledge, and it has cost me everything. And so, my final act is this recording. My final act is to turn off this tape recorder, to place this cassette in a box, and to mail it to someone I hope will understand, someone who will know what to do with it. My final act is to let the secret go. They gave me a new name, a new life, and they told me to forget. But I can't, because sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, I can still hear the static, and I know it's still listening. So that's the story of Object Siren. A story not about a monster from the deep, but about a monster we made ourselves, born from our own ambition and arrogance. It's a chilling reminder that the most terrifying voids are not in the depths of the ocean or the far reaches of space, but in the silence that follows a question we should have never asked. Officially, the disappearance of Miller and Thompson from Sosis Post Argus was a tragedy caused by a storm. But you and I, we know the truth now. They weren't lost to the storm. They were called home by the echo of their own voice. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, be careful what you shout into the darkness. You might not like the sound of your own echo when it finally comes back to you. And some songs, once heard, can never be forgotten.